The Duke announced their engagement. She laughed. "You forgot to ask me, Your Grace." The candles in Lady Pemberton's ballroom numbered in the hundreds. Their flames reflected infinitely in the mirrors that lined the walls, until the entire space seemed to shimmer with captured starlight. It was the sort of extravagance that announced, without subtlety, that the season had officially begun, and that anyone who mattered in London society had better be in attendance or resign themselves to irrelevance. Rosalind Blackwood stood near the refreshment table, her dance card conspicuously empty, and watched the glittering crowd with the detached amusement of a naturalist observing exotic fauna. "You are scowling," her mother hissed from beside her. "Gentlemen do not ask scowling women to dance." "I am not scowling. This is my neutral expression." "Then your neutral expression is costing you a husband." Mrs. Blackwood's fan snapped open and shut in agitation, a semaphore of maternal frustration that Rosalind had learned to interpret over 3 unsuccessful seasons. Snap, snap, snap meant disappointment. Snap, flutter, snap meant a suitable gentleman had been spotted. The current rapid-fire clicking suggested Mrs. Blackwood was approaching the limits of her patience. "Perhaps," Rosalind said mildly, "gentlemen who are frightened away by a woman's facial expressions are not gentlemen worth dancing with. Perhaps gentlemen who must endure your sharp tongue are not gentlemen at all, but saints in disguise. And we should not test the limits of divine patience." Rosalind bit back a smile. Her mother was ridiculous, but she was also occasionally genuinely witty. It was where Rosalind had inherited the tendency, after all. "One more season," Mrs. Blackwood continued, lowering her voice to a register that suggested deadly seriousness. "Your father has agreed to fund one more season, and then he declares himself finished. Clara will need to be launched next year, and we cannot afford to maintain 2 daughters on the marriage market simultaneously. If you do not find a husband by summer's end, Rosalind, your dowry goes to your sisters, and you will spend your remaining years knitting caps for the poor with your Aunt Hermione in Bath." The threat was not new, but it landed with fresh weight this evening. Rosalind looked across the ballroom at her younger sister Clara, 17 and luminous, chattering happily with a group of young ladies near the orchestra. Clara would have no trouble finding a husband. Clara was sweet-tempered and accommodating and would never dream of publicly contradicting a suitor. Clara was everything Rosalind was not. "I am trying, Mamma," Rosalind said, and for once she meant it. "Try harder. Lord Chester has been circling all evening, and he has 15,000 a year. Lord Chester proposed to me last season. I refused him." "Then unrefuse him." "He compared my eyes to boiled gooseberries." Mrs. Blackwood paused. "He meant it as a compliment. He also could not remember whether I had 2 sisters or 3, despite having dined at our home on 4 separate occasions. He thought Beatrice was a spaniel. We do have a spaniel named Beatrice. We have a spaniel named Biscuit, and a daughter named Beatrice, and Lord Chester could not distinguish between them." Rosalind's jaw tightened. "I will not marry a man who cannot be bothered to learn the names of my family. I have some standards." "Standards are a luxury, my dear." Mrs. Blackwood's voice softened slightly, a rare concession to tenderness. "I know you dream of something more than a practical match. I dreamed of it too at your age. But dreams do not pay the butcher, and romance does not keep the rain from leaking through the roof. Find a man who is kind enough and wealthy enough, and learn to be content. That is the most any woman can reasonably expect." Before Rosalind could respond, her mother's fan began its telltale flutter. Snap, flutter, snap. "Lord Chester approaches. Smile. And for heaven's sake, think of something pleasant. You have gone all pinched about the mouth." Lord Chester was indeed approaching, his round face flushed with champagne and determination. He was not an unhandsome man, Rosalind allowed, if one appreciated the aesthetic of an overfed partridge. His waistcoat strained across his midsection, and his cravat had been tied in a style that had been fashionable approximately 3 seasons ago. "Miss Blackwood!" He executed a bow that threatened the structural integrity of his buttons. "What a pleasure to see you again. You are looking very... He squinted at her. "Green. This evening. Very green." "It is the colour of my gown," Rosalind said. "How observant of you." Lord Chester beamed as though she had complimented his intelligence. "I wonder if I might request the honour of the next dance. The waltz, I believe." Rosalind opened her mouth to refuse politely. She had every intention of being polite, but her mother's heel came down discreetly on her toe. "My daughter would be delighted," Mrs. Blackwood said. The waltz was interminable. Lord Chester's hands were damp, his sense of rhythm was approximate at best, and his conversational efforts were limited to observations about the weather. "Quite fine, is it not? The refreshments, the lobster patties are exceptional, and his own estate. 12 bedrooms, you know, not counting the servants' quarters." "How lovely," Rosalind managed. "And do you enjoy living there?" "One does not enjoy an estate, Miss Blackwood. One manages it." He puffed up importantly. "I manage mine with great efficiency. My tenants know their place. My servants know their place. Everything runs precisely as it should." "And where would my place be were I to marry you?" Lord Chester looked startled, as though the question had never occurred to him. "Why, managing the household, of course, producing heirs, the usual womanly duties." He frowned. "You would not interfere?" "With estate matters, naturally. Women have no head for such things." "Naturally," Rosalind repeated flatly. "I am pleased we understand each other." Lord Chester smiled, revealing teeth that had recently made the acquaintance of the lobster patties. "You know, Miss Blackwood, I have been thinking about our future quite seriously. After your rejection last season, which I attributed to maidenly nerves, I resolved to give you time to reconsider, and now that time has passed, I find myself prepared to renew my addresses." Rosalind's stomach dropped. "Lord Chester—" No, allow me to finish. I have rehearsed this." He cleared his throat. "Miss Blackwood, Rosalind, your fortune is substantial. Your breeding is acceptable, and your face is not unpleasant. I believe we would suit admirably. I am prepared to overlook your advanced age and your reputation for being—" He paused delicately. "Difficult. In return, I expect a well-run household, a son within the first 2 years, and no arguments about the household budget. What say you?" They had stopped dancing. Rosalind realized they were standing in the middle of the floor, while couples swirled around them, and Lord Chester was gazing at her with an expression of supreme confidence. He genuinely expected her to say yes. He expected her to be grateful. Something hot and reckless kindled in Rosalind's chest. "Lord Chester," she said clearly, "I would not marry you if you were the last man in England. I would not marry you if refusing meant spending my remaining years knitting caps in Bath. I would not marry you if you came with 20,000 a year and a personality to match." She stepped back from his limp fish grip. "You have no idea what my favorite flower is, or what book I am reading, or what I think about anything at all. You do not want a wife. You want a housekeeper you can bed. Find another woman to fill the position." She curtsied with savage precision and walked off the floor, leaving Lord Chester sputtering in her wake. The whispers started before she reached the edge of the ballroom. "Did you see? Rejected him publicly. 3 seasons and not a single offer she'll accept. The Blackwood girl is impossible. Merchant's daughter. What can you expect?" Rosalind kept her chin high and her spine straight, and she did not let her expression waver until she had pushed through the terrace doors and escaped into the cool night air. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the balustrade, pressing her gloved palms to the cold stone. Stupid. That had been so unforgivably stupid. She could not afford to make enemies, not in her position. The Ton already looked down on her for her father's trade origins, tolerated her only because of her substantial dowry, and her mother's relentless social climbing. She had just handed them ammunition for 100 drawing-room conversations. Difficult, sharp-tongued, ungrateful. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was impossible. Perhaps her standards were unreasonable, her expectations foolish, her dreams of genuine connection nothing but girlish fantasy. Perhaps she should go back inside, find Lord Chester, apologize prettily, accept his offer, and resign herself to a life of producing heirs and not arguing about household budgets. The thought made her want to cast herself off the balcony. Rosalind closed her eyes and listened to the distant strains of music, the murmur of the garden below, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The terrace was mercifully empty. Most guests preferred the stifling crush of the ballroom to the chill of April night air. She would allow herself 5 minutes of self-pity, she decided. 5 minutes to mourn the future she would probably never have. Then she would go back inside, endure her mother's recriminations, and begin the grim work of settling. "You are blocking the most advantageous view of the garden." The voice came from her left, deep and cool, and completely unexpected. Rosalind's eyes flew open. A man stood in the shadows at the far end of the terrace, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark evening clothes rendering him nearly invisible against the unlit portion of the balcony. She had not noticed him when she came outside, had been too consumed with her own humiliation to observe her surroundings. Foolish, dangerous even. She was alone with a strange man in the darkness. "I beg your pardon," she said stiffly. "I did not realize the terrace was occupied." "Evidently." He stepped forward into the light spilling from the ballroom windows, and Rosalind got her first clear look at him. Her breath caught. He was not handsome, not in the soft, symmetrical way that portrait painters favored. His face was too angular, too severe, all sharp planes and hard edges. His jaw could have been carved from granite. His brows were dark slashes that gave him a permanent expression of stern disapproval. His hair was black, but silver threaded through his temples in a way that suggested either advanced age or significant worry, and given the lines of his face, she suspected the latter. But his eyes were what arrested her. Grey as storm clouds, grey as steel, grey as winter dawns. They fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel pinned, catalogued, assessed. She had seen this man before. She knew she had. But where recognition struck like lightning. The Duke of Thornfield, the Iron Duke. Every unmarried woman in London knew his face, his reputation, his eligibility. He was one of the wealthiest men in England, his bloodline impeccable, his influence immense. He was also, by all accounts, cold as a marble statue and approximately as romantic. In the decade since he had assumed his title, he had never once been linked to any woman, not a mistress, not a flirtation, not even a casual dance partner at a ball. The Ton had concluded he was either heartless, uninterested in women entirely, or holding out for a royal princess. And he was standing on this terrace looking at Rosalind as though she were an interesting puzzle he intended to solve. "Your Grace," she managed, dropping into a curtsy. Her heart was pounding. Why was her heart pounding? He was just a man. An insufferably important man, but a man nonetheless. "Forgive me for intruding on your solitude." "You are not intruding. I was merely observing." His gaze travelled over her face with uncomfortable thoroughness. "You are Miss Rosalind Blackwood, daughter of Edward Blackwood of Blackwood Shipping." It was not a question. "I am." "You have refused 7 proposals of marriage over 3 seasons." Rosalind blinked. 8, as of this evening, but I was not aware my romantic failures were common knowledge. "They are not common knowledge. I made inquiries." Something about the way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so utterly without embarrassment, set her teeth on edge. How flattering. Am I to understand you have been investigating me, Your Grace? Thoroughly. He clasped his hands behind his back, regarding her with the air of a man examining a horse he was considering purchasing. Your father's business is sound. Your dowry is substantial but not extraordinary. Your mother is the daughter of a minor baronet, giving you a tenuous claim to gentility. You are educated beyond what is typical for women of your station. You read Greek, I am told, and have opinions about parliamentary reform. I also have opinions about men who recite my particulars as though reading from a ledger. The corner of his mouth twitched. It might have been amusement. It might have been indigestion. With that face, it was impossible to tell. You are also, he continued, as though she had not spoken, 24 years old, which puts you at the outer edge of marriageable age. You have a reputation for being sharp-tongued and ungovernable. You have rejected multiple suitors who were, on paper, perfectly acceptable matches. He paused. The question I find myself asking is, why? Rosalind stared at him. I beg your pardon? Why did you reject them? Lord Chester, Lord Humphrey, Mr. Addington, Sir Rowland Briggs, they were all men of reasonable fortune and tolerable appearance. Any one of them would have provided you with security and social standing, yet you refused them all. His grey eyes narrowed. I wish to understand your criteria. No one had ever asked her that before. Not her mother, not her friends, not the suitors themselves. They had all assumed she was being foolish, capricious, unreasonable. None of them had thought to ask what she actually wanted. The novelty of it loosened her tongue. They did not see me, she said. Any of them. They saw my dowry. They saw an acceptable face and adequate breeding. They saw a woman who would manage their households and warm their beds and produce their heirs. Not one of them knew my favorite book, or my most treasured memory, or what I dreamed about at night. Not one of them asked. She lifted her chin, daring him to mock her. I will not marry a man who cannot be bothered to know who I am. The Duke was silent for a long moment. His expression remained impassive, but something shifted in those grey eyes, a flicker of something she could not name. An unusual perspective, he said finally. Most women of your station would consider security sufficient grounds for marriage. I am not most women. No. His gaze held hers. You are not. The words hung between them, weighted with something Rosalind did not understand. She became suddenly, acutely aware of their situation. Alone on a darkened terrace, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive, sandalwood and bergamot, while the ballroom glittered behind them like a world apart. She should leave. She should absolutely leave. Why are you asking me these questions? She demanded instead. Why did you investigate me? What possible interest could the Duke of Thornfield have in a merchant's daughter who cannot manage to secure a husband? I should think that would be obvious. It is not. He inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement. Very well. I shall be direct. He paused, and for the first time something that might have been uncertainty crossed his features. Miss Blackwood, I find myself in need of a wife. Rosalind's heart stuttered. I beg your pardon? A wife, he repeated, as though she had not heard clearly. I have a young ward, my cousin's daughter, who will need to be presented to society in a few years. My aunt, the Dowager Duchess, has made it clear that no proper household can launch a young lady without a duchess at its head. Additionally, I require an heir, as is customary for men of my position. I have therefore concluded that marriage is necessary." He delivered this speech with all the passion of a man ordering new boots. Rosalind felt her jaw slackening. "And you have decided," she said slowly, "that I should be this wife. You meet my criteria. You are intelligent. I have no patience for stupid women. You are wealthy enough that no one can accuse me of fortune hunting, which would be tedious. You are beautiful, which will make the production of heirs less onerous." He said this with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to describe the weather. "And most importantly, your repeated rejections of romantic proposals suggest you are practical rather than sentimental. I have no interest in a wife who will expect love from our arrangement. I require a partnership based on mutual benefit and rational expectations." Rosalind opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. The Duke of Thornfield was proposing to her. The Duke of Thornfield, one of the most powerful men in England, a man who could have his pick of any eligible woman in the kingdom, was standing on this terrace and offering her a marriage of cold, calculated convenience. And he thought she would accept because she was practical, because he had concluded from her rejections of men who did not see her that she did not actually want to be seen at all. The laugh escaped before she could stop it, a sharp, incredulous bark of genuine mirth. The Duke's brows drew together. "I fail to see the humour." "Of course you don't." Rosalind pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to contain her laughter and failing miserably. "Your Grace, I refused those men because they treated marriage as a transaction, because they saw me as a set of criteria to be evaluated rather than a person to be known. And you have just delivered the most transactional proposal I have ever received, complete with a list of my qualifications, while somehow concluding this would be appealing to me." A flush crept up his neck. It was the first crack in his composure she had witnessed. "I was attempting to be clear about my expectations. You were attempting to acquire a duchess the same way you might acquire a new hunting dog. Adequate breeding, tolerable appearance, unlikely to cause problems." She shook her head, still laughing. "I thank you for the honour, Your Grace, truly. It is not every day a woman of my station receives an offer from a duke, but I must decline." His jaw tightened. "You are refusing me. I am refusing you. Might I ask why?" "Because you have not the faintest idea who I am." Rosalind met his eyes squarely. "You investigated me, Your Grace. You learned my father's income and my mother's bloodline and the number of proposals I have rejected. But do you know my favorite flower, my most treasured memory, what makes me laugh or weep or lie awake at night?" She watched his face, saw the flicker of uncertainty he could not quite hide. "You know nothing about me that could not be found in a ledger, and I will not marry a man who does not care to know more." Before he could respond, before she could lose her nerve, or, worse, begin to feel guilty for the expression that had crossed his face, she gathered her skirts and strode toward the terrace doors. She had almost reached them when his voice stopped her. "Wildflowers." Rosalind turned. "I beg your pardon?" "Your favorite flower." He stood where she had left him, silhouetted against the night sky, his face unreadable. "You mentioned to your sister last week that you preferred wildflowers to hothouse roses. You said roses were too cultivated, too predictable. You said wildflowers had more character." The air left her lungs. You heard that?" "I told you. I made inquiries." Something shifted in his expression, something almost vulnerable, though it disappeared so quickly she could not be sure she had seen it at all. "I know you take your tea with precisely 1 sugar and a splash of milk, and that you despise lemon curd, but will not admit it because your mother is proud of her recipe. I know you walk in Hyde Park every morning at 7, before the fashionable hour, because you prefer the quiet. I know you have read Miss Austen's novels so many times that your copies are falling apart at the bindings." He paused. "I know you told your Younger sister, that you still believed in true love, even if you had not found it yet, and that you would not settle for anything less, no matter what anyone said. Rosalind could not breathe. She could not move. She could only stand there, frozen, as the Duke of Thornfield stripped away her armor with words she had never expected him to know. "I apologize," he said quietly. "You were right. I approached this as a transaction because transactions are what I understand. Emotion is not my strength." He looked away toward the darkened garden. "I have spent the last decade rebuilding what my father's foolishness nearly destroyed. I have kept myself apart from anything that might compromise my judgment. And when I concluded I needed a wife, I looked for a woman who would not expect what I could not give." "And what is it you believe you cannot give?" His grey eyes met hers. In the candlelight spilling from the windows, they looked almost silver. "Love, Miss Blackwood. I cannot give love." He said it flatly, without self-pity. "I am not certain I am capable of it. But I am capable of respect. I am capable of partnership. I am capable of ensuring you want for nothing, and that your family is protected and provided for. I know that is not what you hoped for, but it is what I have to offer." The honesty of it caught her off guard. This was not the cold, calculating Duke who had listed her qualifications like items in an inventory. This was something raw, more human, a man admitting his own limitations with what seemed like genuine regret. She should still refuse. She should turn around, walk back into the ballroom, and forget this conversation ever happened. But something held her there, caught by the unexpected depth in his eyes. "Why me?" she asked. "You could have any woman in England. Women with better bloodlines, more suitable temperaments. Why pursue someone you knew would reject you?" "Because you did reject them." His mouth twisted in something that was not quite a smile. "Every suitor who approached you with wealth and expectations, and no genuine interest in who you were, you sent them away. You demanded more than the world told you to expect. I found that—" He paused, searching for words. "Intriguing?" "You found my stubbornness intriguing. I found your standards admirable." He held her gaze. "And I found myself wondering if those standards were truly as impossible to meet as everyone assumes, or if no one had simply tried." The terrace doors burst open behind her. "Sebastian! There you are!" An older woman swept onto the balcony, her silver hair piled high and her bearing imperious. She was dressed in the height of fashion, every jewel at her throat and ears proclaiming wealth and status. Her eyes grey like the Duke's, but harder swept over Rosalind with barely concealed assessment. "Aunt," the Duke's voice went flat, "this is not the moment. On the contrary, this is precisely the moment." The Dowager Duchess of Thornfield, for that, was clearly who this woman was, smiled with all the warmth of a winter frost. "I have just learned the most delightful news. Sebastian, my dear, you must return to the ballroom immediately. Everyone is asking after you, and there is an announcement to be made." "What announcement?" "Your engagement, of course." The Dowager's smile widened. "News of your courtship of Miss Blackwood has been circulating for weeks. Your inquiries were hardly subtle, my dear, and I have taken the liberty of confirming the happy news to Lady Pemberton. She is thrilled to host the announcement at her ball." Rosalind's blood ran cold. "I have not agreed." "Come, come, no need for maidenly protests." The Dowager linked her arm through Rosalind's, her grip surprisingly strong. "A duke does not investigate a woman so thoroughly unless his intentions are fixed, and a woman in your position can hardly refuse such an advantageous match. The announcement will take place in 10 minutes. Try to look pleased, my dear. It is unbecoming to appear anything less than delighted when one has secured the greatest catch of the season." "Aunt!" The Duke's voice cracked like a whip. "Release her, now!" "Don't be tiresome, Sebastian. You know as well as I that you need a wife, and this girl will do as well as any other. Better, really, she has money and some looks, and she seems robust enough to breed well. The announcement has already been made in all but name. To retract it now would be a scandal." "I do not care about scandal." "But you do care about Charlotte." The dowager's voice dropped, turning silky and dangerous. "Your ward is at a delicate age, Sebastian. Any hint of impropriety surrounding your household, any suggestion that you are the sort of man who trifles with young women's reputations on darkened terraces, would make her presentation to society difficult." The Duke went still. Rosalind felt the trap closing around them both. The dowager was a masterful manipulator. She could see that now. The woman had orchestrated this entire scenario, perhaps even engineered Rosalind's escape to the terrace. Knowing her nephew would be there all to force a match she had decided was suitable. And she was using a young girl as leverage. "You are contemptible," Rosalind said quietly. The dowager's eyes glittered. "I am practical, Miss Blackwood, a trait you ought to appreciate given your situation." She tugged Rosalind toward the doors. "Now, let us proceed to the ballroom. The ton is waiting, and it would not do to keep them." The next few minutes passed in a blur of candlelight and faces. Rosalind was aware of the Duke walking behind them, his expression thunderous, his attempts to intervene smoothly, deflected by his aunt's stream of chatter. She was aware of her own mother's face, first confused, then slowly dawning with incredulous delight as the dowager swept past her with a whispered explanation. She was aware of the orchestra falling silent, of Lady Pemberton ascending the dais at the end of the ballroom, of hundreds of eyes turning toward her with curiosity and envy and barely veiled malice. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," Lady Pemberton announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed room. "It is my very great pleasure to share the most wonderful news. His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield, has asked me to announce his engagement to Miss Rosalind Blackwood." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, a smattering of applause. Rosalind felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on her like a physical force. This could not be happening. This could not actually be happening. The Duke stepped forward, his face arranged in a mask of formal courtesy that did not quite hide the tension around his eyes. He reached for her hand to kiss it, presumably, or to make some gesture of affection for the crowd. And something in Rosalind snapped. She began to laugh. It started as a giggle, almost hysterical, but it quickly grew into something fuller, richer, genuine mirth bubbling up from a place beyond fear or propriety. She laughed until tears pricked at her eyes, until gasps of shock rippled through the assembled guests, until the Duke stood frozen before her with his hand extended and his expression utterly confounded. "Miss Blackwood." "Forgive me," she managed, pressing a hand to her stomach. "Forgive me, but I find I cannot help myself." She straightened, met his grey eyes, and smiled with all the sweetness she did not feel. "Your Grace, I believe you have forgotten something rather essential." His brow furrowed. "And what would that be?" "You forgot to ask me." She let the words carry across the silent ballroom, clear and bright and absolutely devastating. "You forgot to ask me, Your Grace." The silence that followed was deafening. Rosalind watched as the colour drained from the Duke's face, as the implications of her words sank in. She watched the dowager's expression curdle from satisfaction to fury. She watched the tone exchange glances of scandalized delight, already composing the gossip they would spread to every drawing-room in London by morning. She should be terrified. She had just publicly humiliated one of the most powerful men in England. But instead, she felt free. "There has been no proposal," she continued, her voice carrying through the crystal-clear acoustics of the ballroom. "His Grace has not asked for my hand. He has not received my acceptance, and I am afraid I cannot be party to an engagement that does not, in fact, exist." The Duke's jaw worked. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Rosalind braced herself for fury, for cold dismissal, for the sort of aristocratic contempt that could destroy her family's social standing with a single word. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The corner of his mouth twitched. "You are quite right," he said slowly. "I did forget." He turned to face the crowd, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same weight of authority he must use in the House of Lords. "My aunt has acted prematurely. There is no engagement, not because Miss Blackwood is unwilling, but because I have not yet proven myself worthy of her hand." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beside her, Rosalind heard the Dowager make a strangled sound of outrage. "Miss Blackwood has made clear that she expects to be known, truly known, before she will consider matrimony." The Duke's grey eyes found hers, and in them she saw something she had not expected: respect, and beneath it a glimmer of challenge. "It seems I have been too focused on efficiency, and not enough on earning her regard. I intend to rectify that error." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You have humiliated me before the entire ton, Miss Blackwood. It is the first time in my adult life anyone has dared." His gaze held hers. "I find I am not as angry as I should be." "You should be furious." "I should be." His voice dropped further, barely a murmur. "Instead, I find myself thinking that any woman bold enough to laugh at a duke in front of 500 witnesses is a woman worth understanding." He stepped back, raising his voice once more for the benefit of the room. "Until Miss Blackwood gives me a definitive refusal, I shall consider myself her suitor. I will court her properly, not with lists of qualifications, but with genuine effort to earn her esteem." He looked at her, and the challenge in his eyes was unmistakable. "If she will permit me." Every face in the ballroom turned to Rosalind. She should refuse. She should deliver that definitive no and escape this madness entirely. The Duke was cold and calculating, and had approached marriage like a business transaction. He had allowed his aunt to force a public announcement without her consent. He was everything she had sworn she would never accept. But he had known about the wildflowers. He had listened when she spoke to her sisters. He had admitted his limitations with something that looked almost like regret. And he had just, in front of everyone who mattered in London, accepted her challenge instead of retaliating against her humiliation. "You may call," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow, at 4 o'clock. We shall see if you can manage a proper introduction." The Duke inclined his head. "Until tomorrow, then." He stepped back, and the ballroom erupted into chaos, questions and exclamations, and the frantic flutter of fans as the ton tried to process what they had just witnessed. The Dowager was arguing furiously with Lady Pemberton. Mrs. Blackwood looked like she might faint from a combination of horror and hope. Rosalind ignored all of it. She walked toward the terrace doors, desperate for air, for silence, for a moment to understand what she had just done. She had trapped herself. By demanding he caught her properly, by refusing to give the definitive no that would end this farce, she had bound herself into an arrangement she had never wanted. The Duke of Thornfield would call on her tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The ton would watch their every interaction with hungry eyes. Her mother would be impossible. And yet, as she stepped onto the terrace, breathing in the cool night air, Rosalind found herself thinking about the look in his eyes when he'd accepted her challenge. Not fury, not cold calculation, something that looked almost like hope. The most terrifying man in England had looked at her like she was a puzzle worth solving. Like her standards were not impossible, but merely demanding. Like he was willing to try. Wildflowers, he had said. "You prefer wild flowers to roses." She leaned against the balustrade, where their conversation had begun barely an hour ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Below her, the garden stretched out in moonlit shadows, fragrant with spring blooms she could not see but only sense. What had she done? What was she about to do? From inside, she heard the orchestra strike up again a waltz, lilting and romantic, utterly at odds with the chaos of the evening. She should go back inside. She should find her mother, endure the interrogation, begin preparing for whatever came next. Instead, she stayed on the terrace, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, the Duke of Thornfield would call. Tomorrow, her impossible standards would be put to the test by a man who had never, by his own admission, given love to anyone. Tomorrow, she would begin to discover whether the Iron Duke could melt. And despite everything, despite her fear, her frustration, her certainty that this was madness, Rosalind found that she was curious. Just a little, just enough. The clock in the Blackwood drawing-room had never ticked so loudly. Rosalind sat rigidly in the chair by the window, her needlework abandoned in her lap, watching the street below with a combination of dread and anticipation that made her stomach churn. It was 4:45. In 15 minutes, the Duke of Thornfield would arrive for his first official call, and she had no idea what to expect. "Stop fidgeting," her mother commanded from the settee, where she was arranging and rearranging the tea service for the 4th time. "You look like a woman awaiting execution rather than a courtship call from the most eligible man in England." "Perhaps because I feel like a woman awaiting execution." "Nonsense. You feel like a woman who has been handed an extraordinary opportunity and is too stubborn to appreciate it." Mrs. Blackwood adjusted the angle of the sugar bowl by approximately 1 degree. "Do you know how many mothers in London would commit actual crimes to secure what you have stumbled into? The Duke of Thornfield courting their daughter? It is the stuff of fairy tales. Fairy tales rarely begin with public humiliation and coerced announcements. Details." Her mother waved a dismissive hand. "The point is that he is coming here, to this house, to court you. Whatever happened at that ball, he has clearly decided you are worth pursuing. All you must do is not ruin it." Rosalind bit back a sharp retort. She had spent most of the night lying awake, replaying the events of Lady Pemberton's ball in excruciating detail. The Duke's cold proposal, her laughter, the Dowager's machinations, and then, inexplicably, the Duke's acceptance of her challenge, his declaration that he would court her properly, that he would prove himself worthy. She still did not understand why he had done it. Any other man in his position would have been furious. He could have destroyed her with a word, a look, a well-placed rumour. Instead, he had turned her rejection into an invitation, transformed his humiliation into an opportunity. Either he was mad, or he was playing a game she did not yet comprehend. "Rosalind." Her mother's voice had softened, and when Rosalind looked up, she found Mrs. Blackwood watching her with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "I know this is not what you imagined. I know you wanted romance and grand passion and all those things young women dream about. But sometimes the greatest loves begin as the most unlikely partnerships. Give him a chance. That is all I ask." Before Rosalind could respond, the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones drew her attention back to the window. A gleaming black coach had pulled up before the house, drawn by a matched pair of grey horses that probably cost more than her father earned in a year. The door opened, and the Duke of Thornfield descended to the pavement. He was dressed immaculately in a dark blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his cravat tied in a style that managed to be both fashionable and understated. In his hands he carried a small bouquet of flowers, wild flowers. Rosalind's breath caught. He had actually remembered. He had gone out of his way to procure wildflowers, delicate bluebells, and white wood anemones, and sprigs of wild violet, instead of the hothouse roses that any other suitor would have offered. "Oh, how charming," her mother murmured, craning to see. "Is that of those wild flowers? How unconventional." "They are my favourite," Rosalind heard herself say. Mrs. Blackwood turned to stare at her. "Since when?" "Since always. I mentioned it to Clara last week." "And he knew this?" Her mother's eyes widened. "He knew this, and he actually procured them? From where? It is April, wildflowers are hardly in season." The knocker sounded, and Mrs. Blackwood's questions dissolved into a flurry of activity. She smoothed her skirts, pinched colour into her cheeks, and arranged herself on the settee with an expression of studied, casual welcome. "Remember," she hissed at Rosalind, "you are pleased to see him. Not pleased, exactly, that would be too eager but graciously receptive, and for heaven's sake try to smile without looking like you are baring your teeth." The butler appeared in the doorway. "His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield." And then he was there. The drawing-room, which had always seemed perfectly adequate in size, suddenly felt impossibly small. The Duke's presence filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with his physical dimensions and everything to do with the sheer force of his personality. Those grey eyes swept the room once, cataloguing everything, before settling on Rosalind with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Blackwood." He bowed with precise formality. "Thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace." Mrs. Blackwood's voice had achieved a register of breathless delight that Rosalind had never heard before. "What an honour! Please do sit down. Tea will be served momentarily. We are so very pleased." "These are for you," the Duke said, cutting through her mother's chatter as though it did not exist. He crossed the room and held out the wildflower bouquet to Rosalind. "I was told you prefer them to cultivated blooms." "I do." Rosalind accepted the flowers, acutely aware of the brush of his gloved fingers against hers. "Though I confess I am curious how you procured them. It is rather early in the season. I have a conservatory at Thornfield House. My gardener was persuaded to cultivate some specimens specifically for this purpose." The corner of his mouth twitched. "He thought I had gone mad. I believe his exact words were, 'Weeds, Your Grace. You want me to grow weeds intentionally.'" Rosalind felt her lips curve despite herself. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that weeds were merely flowers that had not yet been properly appreciated, and that I was attempting to become the sort of man who could recognize value where others saw only nuisance." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that went far beyond horticulture. Rosalind found herself holding his gaze, searching those grey depths for some hint of mockery or manipulation. She found only steady sincerity. "That is," she hesitated, "that is surprisingly philosophical, Your Grace. I have had a great deal of time to think since last evening." He settled into the chair across from her, his posture formal but his eyes never leaving her face. "I realized I approached you with a strategy suited for a business negotiation rather than a courtship. I treated you as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. You were right to reject such an approach." Mrs. Blackwood made a small sound of astonishment. Rosalind suspected it was the first time she had ever heard a duke admit to being wrong about anything. "I am here to remedy that error," the Duke continued. "If you will permit me, I would like to begin again, not with lists of qualifications or discussions of mutual benefit, but with conversation. He said the word as though it were slightly foreign, a language he was still learning to speak. I believe the customary approach is to ask after your interests and share something of my own. Though I confess, the process feels inefficient. Courtship is not meant to be efficient, Your Grace. So I am learning. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a crack in the facade of noble composure. May I be frank with you, Miss Blackwood? I rather thought you already were. More frank, then. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so that her mother, straining to hear from across the room, could not make out his words. I have never courted anyone. I have never wished to. The women who have been presented to me as suitable matches have uniformly been polished, practiced. They say what they believe I wish to hear and hide whatever genuine thoughts they might possess behind layers of social performance. His grey eyes held hers. You laughed at me in front of 500 people. You told me I was treating marriage like a business transaction, and you refused to participate in my acquisition strategy. It was the most honest interaction I have had with a woman in over a decade. Rosalind's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. And you found that appealing? I found it terrifying. His voice was quiet, intense. I have spent my entire adult life maintaining control of my estates, my investments, my emotions, my reputation. You disrupted all of that with a single laugh. I should have walked away, found a more compliant candidate, resumed my original strategy. He paused. Instead, I find myself unable to stop thinking about you. It is extremely inconvenient. The tea arrived, carried by a maid who seemed utterly oblivious to the charged atmosphere in the room. Mrs. Blackwood swooped in to manage the pouring, filling the silence with chatter about the weather, the upcoming social calendar, the delightful quality of the tea leaves. Rosalind barely heard any of it. The Duke of Thornfield, the Iron Duke, the coldest man in England, had just admitted that she terrified him, that she had disrupted his carefully controlled existence, that he could not stop thinking about her. It should not have pleased her as much as it did. "Tell me about your ward," she heard herself say, when the tea had been distributed and her mother had reluctantly subsided into silence. "Lady Charlotte, how old is she?" Something flickered across the Duke's face, surprise, perhaps, that she had remembered the girl's existence. "She is 14, nearly 15 now. Her parents, my cousin and his wife, died of fever 2 years ago. I became her guardian by default." "By default?" There was no one else. His voice was flat, but Rosalind detected something beneath the surface, guilt, perhaps, or regret. Her maternal family wanted nothing to do with her. The Ashworths considered her father's branch of the family somewhat disreputable. I was the only option. And how does she fare? Being uprooted from her home, losing her parents, being placed in the care of a stranger that must be tremendously difficult for a young girl. The Duke's jaw tightened. She is provided for. She has the best governesses, the finest tutors, every material comfort. That is not what I asked. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its formal authority. She is not happy. I am aware of that. I do not know how to reach her. She was close to her parents, and losing them devastated her. I have tried to give her structure, stability, routine. She responds with silence and avoidance. He looked away toward the window. I suspect she would have preferred almost any other guardian. Have you spent time with her? Talked with her about her parents, her memories, her feelings? He hesitated. I am not skilled at such conversations. Then perhaps that is where you should begin. Rosalind set down her teacup, something fierce kindling in her chest. She is a child who has lost everything she loved. She does not need structure and routine. She needs to know that someone sees her grief and shares it. She needs to feel less alone. The Duke's grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw something unexpected: vulnerability. And how does one accomplish that precisely? I did not have the sort of childhood that taught me to navigate such things. What sort of childhood did you have? The question hung between them. Mrs. Blackwood had gone very still on the settee, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. An educational one, the Duke said finally. My father was a romantic. He loved extravagantly, trusted blindly, felt everything with tremendous intensity. When my mother died, he was devastated, but within a year he had remarried. His second wife was calculating. She convinced him to make a series of investments that nearly destroyed the duchy. By the time I inherited at 21, we were on the brink of ruin. Rosalind's breath caught. I had no idea. Very few people do. I spent the next decade rebuilding the finances, the estates, the family reputation. Everything my father's emotions had destroyed, I reconstructed through logic and control. His voice hardened. I learned that sentiment was weakness, that love made men foolish, that the only way to protect what mattered was to keep feeling at arm's length. And so you decided to marry without love. I decided to marry sensibly, to choose a partner based on practical considerations rather than emotional ones, to protect myself and any children I might have from the devastation I witnessed in my own family. He met her eyes. You must understand, Miss Blackwood. I am not cold by nature. I made myself cold because the alternative seemed too dangerous. The confession cracked something open in Rosalind's chest. She had assumed his distance was arrogance, his efficiency disdain. She had not considered that it might be armor, carefully constructed protection against the kind of pain that had shaped him. That sounds very lonely, she said softly. It is effective. That is not the same thing. His gaze held hers, and for a moment the masks between them dropped entirely. She saw him not. The Duke, not the Iron Man, but Sebastian Ashworth, a boy who had watched his father's love destroy everything, who had rebuilt an empire through sheer force of will, who had never allowed himself to want what he feared most. No, he admitted, it is not. The clock on the mantel chimed 5, breaking the spell. Mrs. Blackwood stirred, social instinct overriding her fascination with the conversation she had been witnessing. My goodness, how time flies! Your Grace, you must stay for dinner. I insist. Mr. Blackwood will be home shortly, and I know he would be delighted to make your acquaintance properly. I would be honored, the Duke said, rising from his chair. But I should not like to impose. Another time, perhaps. He turned to Rosalind, and something in his expression had shifted, a warmth that had not been there before, tentative, but real. Miss Blackwood, might I call again tomorrow? There is still much I wish to learn about you. Yes, Rosalind heard herself say. I would like that. He bowed over her hand, his lips brushing her knuckles through the thin fabric of her gloves. The touch was formal, proper, entirely appropriate, and yet it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with propriety. Until tomorrow, then. After he left, Mrs. Blackwood collapsed against the settee cushions with a dramatic sigh. Well, that was not what I expected at all. No, Rosalind agreed, staring at the wildflowers in her hands. It was not. That night, alone in her room, she pressed one of the bluebells between the pages of her worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, and thought about men who built walls against love because they had seen what love could destroy. She thought about how terrifying it must be to feel that armor cracking. And she thought, with a flutter of something that might have been hope, that perhaps the Iron Duke was not so different from her after all. The courtship of the Duke of Thornfield and Miss Rosalind Blackwood became the sensation of the season, Every day brought new evidence that the Duke was utterly, systematically, almost obsessively devoted to his pursuit. He appeared at social events he had never deigned to attend before, musicales, garden parties, afternoon teas, and made a point of seeking Rosalind out for conversation. He sent wildflowers every morning, each bouquet accompanied by a brief note that revealed he had been paying attention to things she had mentioned in passing. You spoke of your love for astronomy. There is to be a meteor shower next week. Would you do me the honour of viewing it from Thornfield House? I am told the roof terrace offers excellent sight lines. Your sister Clara mentioned that you have been wanting to read the new Scott novel, but the lending library has a long waiting list. I have taken the liberty of procuring a copy. Consider it a loan, not a gift, if that makes you more comfortable accepting it. I noticed you seemed melancholy yesterday. I hope I was not the cause. If there is anything troubling you, I would consider it an honor to listen. The notes were not romantic in the traditional sense. They lacked flowery protestations and poetic declarations, but they revealed something Rosalind found far more compelling than conventional courtship language. They showed that he was watching her, learning her, making an effort to understand who she was beneath the sharp tongue and defensive wit. It was seductive in a way she had not anticipated. "He is courting you properly," Clara observed one afternoon, peering over Rosalind's shoulder as she read the latest note. "I mean, really properly, like someone who actually wants to know you, not just acquire you. It seems that way. And you like him. Don't deny it, I can tell. You smile when his notes arrive. You spend ages choosing your gowns before events where you know he will be present. You actually let Mother do your hair this morning without complaining." Rosalind felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am simply being polite. He is making an effort, and it would be churlish not to acknowledge it." Clara's knowing smile was infuriating. "And the fact that you blush whenever his name is mentioned, that is politeness as well? Go away, Clara." But after her sister left, Rosalind found herself staring at the note in her hands, rereading his words for the 10th time that hour. "If there is anything troubling you, I would consider it an honor to listen." No one had ever said that to her before. No suitor, no friend, not even her family. Everyone expected Rosalind to be sharp and self-sufficient, and impervious to distress. The idea that someone might want to know her troubles, might consider it an honor to share her burdens, was so foreign it almost hurt. 3 weeks into the courtship, everything changed. It began with an invitation to tea at Thornfield House, not the grand ducal residence in Mayfair, but the more intimate townhouse where the Duke actually lived when Parliament was in session. Rosalind's mother insisted on accompanying her, propriety demanding a chaperone, but Mrs. Blackwood was swiftly distracted by the Dowager Duchess, who swept her away to inspect the picture gallery with barely concealed ulterior motives. This left Rosalind alone with the Duke in the drawing-room, an arrangement that should have felt awkward, but instead felt like relief. "My aunt has some scheme in mind," Sebastian said, watching the doorway through which the 2 older women had vanished. "She has been too cooperative lately. It makes me suspicious. Perhaps she has accepted the inevitable. My aunt never accepts anything. She merely changes tactics." He turned to her, and his expression softened. "But that is a concern for another time. There is someone I would like you to meet." He led her through the house, past elegant rooms filled with priceless art and carefully arranged furniture, until they reached a door at the end of a quiet corridor. He paused with his hand on the latch. "I should warn you," he said. "Charlotte is not. She does not take well to strangers. She may be cold or dismissive. Please do not take it personally." "I understand." He opened the door. The room beyond was clearly a private sitting room, decorated in soft colours and filled with books and embroidery, and all the trappings of a young lady's sanctuary. By the window, curled in an armchair with a book in her lap, sat a girl with dark hair and grey eyes, so like the Duke's that their relationship was immediately apparent. She looked up when they entered, and her expression closed like a door slamming shut. Charlotte. Sebastian's voice was careful, measured. I would like to introduce Miss Rosalind Blackwood. She has been kind enough to accept my courtship, and I thought, I know who she is. Charlotte's voice was flat. Everyone knows. The woman who laughed at you in front of all of London. Rosalind felt Sebastian stiffen beside her, but she stepped forward before he could respond. I did laugh at him, she said calmly. He was being quite ridiculous. He had prepared a whole speech about my qualifications, as though he were hiring a housekeeper, and it was really the most absurd proposal I have ever received. I have received 8, you know. He was by far the worst at it. Charlotte blinked, clearly not expecting this response. You told him he was absurd? To his face, in front of 500 witnesses. I believe I also told him he had forgotten to ask me, which was technically true. He had announced an engagement without bothering to propose first. Rosalind settled into the chair opposite Charlotte as though they were old friends sharing gossip. In his defense, he has improved considerably since then. He now asks before assuming, and he has learned that wildflowers are more valuable than roses, which shows genuine progress. A tiny crack appeared in Charlotte's defensive armor, the ghost of something that might have been curiosity. He sent you wildflowers? Every day for 3 weeks. Bluebells mostly. He had his gardener grow them specially, which apparently caused quite the scandal in the conservatory. Rosalind leaned forward conspiratorially. Between us, I think the gardener believes your guardian has gone entirely mad. First weeds on purpose, now courting a woman who publicly humiliated him. The household is terribly confused. Charlotte's lips twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. He is very strange, she said quietly. He never knows what to say to me. He just stands in doorways and asks if I need anything, and then looks relieved when I say no. That sounds rather like him. Rosalind glanced at Sebastian, who was watching this exchange with an expression of barely concealed amazement. He is not very good at feelings, I have noticed. He tends to approach everything as though it were a military campaign, lists of objectives, strategies for success. It must be very odd to live with. It is. Charlotte's voice dropped. He is nothing like my father. My father would have... She stopped, her face crumpling, and looked quickly away. Rosalind did not reach out, did not offer empty comfort. She simply sat quietly, allowing the girl space for her grief. I lost my grandmother when I was 12, she said after a moment. She was my favorite person in the world. She used to let me stay up late reading by candlelight, and she taught me to play chess, and she always took my side when my mother and I argued. She paused. When she died, everyone kept telling me she was in a better place, or that time would heal the pain, or that I should be grateful for the years I had with her. And I wanted to scream at all of them, because none of those things helped. They just made me feel like my grief was inconvenient. Charlotte looked up, tears glittering in her grey eyes. People say that to me too. That my parents are with God now. That I should focus on my blessings. That I am lucky to have such a wealthy guardian. It is rubbish, is it not? As though grief is something to be managed efficiently rather than felt. Yes. Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. It is rubbish. What helped me, the only thing that helped, was when someone simply sat with me and let me talk about her, not about death or heaven or moving forward, just about her. The way she laughed, the sound of her voice, the things she used to say. Rosalind met Charlotte's eyes. I would very much like to hear about your parents, if you would ever want to tell me. Not because it will make the grief go away, but because they deserve to be remembered by someone other than just you." The tears spilled over then, tracking down Charlotte's cheeks. But something in her expression had shifted, a loosening, an opening. She looked at Rosalind as though seeing her for the first time. "You mean that?" she said. "You actually mean it?" "I do." Charlotte was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she began to speak. She talked about her father's laugh, how it filled rooms, how it made everyone around him smile. She talked about her mother's singing, the lullabies she used to hum while brushing Charlotte's hair. She talked about family dinners and country walks, and the way her parents used to dance together in the parlor when they thought no one was watching. She talked for nearly an hour, and Rosalind listened to every word. When they finally rose to leave, Charlotte caught Rosalind's hand. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Not because of him, because I should like to talk to you again, if you want to." Rosalind squeezed her fingers. "I would like that very much." Outside in the corridor, Sebastian was silent. He walked beside her through the house, his expression unreadable, until they reached a small study that was clearly his private domain, books everywhere, papers scattered across a massive desk, the scent of leather and ink and sandalwood. He closed the door behind them, leaning against it heavily. "How did you do that?" Rosalind turned to face him. "Do what?" "She has not spoken to anyone, not me, not her governesses, not the parade of suitable companions I have hired about her parents since they died. She has been locked in silence for 2 years. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual control. "You were with her for an hour, and she told you everything." "I did not do anything extraordinary. I simply asked, and then I listened." "I have asked, dozens of times. She never answers." "Perhaps because you ask like it is an item on a list." "Discuss parental grief with Ward. Check." Rosalind kept her voice gentle, not accusatory. "She does not need you to solve her grief, Sebastian. She needs you to share it, to be willing to feel it alongside her, not stand at a safe distance and manage it." He flinched at the sound of his Christian name the first time she had used it, but he did not correct her. "I do not know how," he said quietly. "To feel things alongside someone. I do not know how to let myself—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I know." Rosalind crossed the room and stood before him, close enough to touch if she dared. "I know you built walls for good reasons. I know that letting them down feels dangerous. But that girl needs you. Not a guardian who provides for her materially. She needs someone who will love her, messily and imperfectly and fully. And if I am not capable of that, then you will learn." She held his gaze. "The same way you are learning to court me. One terrifying step at a time." Something cracked in his expression, a breaking open of the composure he wore like armor. For a moment, he looked younger than his years, lost and uncertain in a way the Iron Duke was never supposed to be. "I am afraid," he admitted, the words barely audible. "I am afraid that if I let myself feel, if I stop controlling everything, I will lose myself the way my father did. I will make terrible decisions because my heart overwhelmed my judgment. I will fail the people depending on me." "Or," Rosalind said softly, "you will become the kind of man who can actually connect with those people, who can give Charlotte the uncle she needs, who can—" She hesitated, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the heat radiating from his body, of the grey eyes fixed on her face with devastating intensity. "Who can what?" His voice had dropped to a murmur. "Who can be worthy of being loved in return?" The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something that made her pulse race. She should step back. She should preserve proper distance, maintain the boundaries of courtship, protect herself from the vulnerability she saw reflected in his eyes. She did not move. Rosalind. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a question. I am trying. I want you to know that. I am trying to be someone who deserves... The door burst open. Your Grace! A servant stood in the doorway, face pale with urgency. Forgive the interruption, but there is a matter requiring immediate attention. Lord Ashworth has arrived. He claims he has business regarding Lady Charlotte's guardianship. Sebastian's expression shuttered instantly, the moment of vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of the Duke. He straightened, stepped away from Rosalind, and became again the cold, controlled man she had first met on Lady Pemberton's terrace. Lord Ashworth has no claim on Charlotte's guardianship. I was appointed in the will. He says there are irregularities, Your Grace. He has brought a solicitor. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Excuse me, Miss Blackwood. It seems I have matters to attend to. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone in his study, surrounded by his books and papers and the lingering scent of sandalwood. She did not see him again that day. Over the following weeks, the shadow of Lord Ashworth fell across everything. Rosalind learned the details through a combination of society gossip and Sebastian's terse explanations during the courtship calls he continued despite the crisis. Lord Ashworth was Charlotte's maternal uncle, a man who had shown no interest in the girl after her parents' death, but who had now discovered that Charlotte stood to inherit a substantial fortune from her mother's family when she came of age. He wanted guardianship. He claimed Sebastian was unsuitable too, cold, too distant, too focused on his political duties to properly care for a young girl. He had filed legal challenges that threatened to drag Charlotte through public proceedings that would lay bare all the private details of her grief and recovery. He does not want her, Sebastian said one afternoon, his voice tight with suppressed fury. He wants her money. If he gains control of her guardianship, he will have authority over her inheritance until she is 25. He will bleed it dry. Can you not fight him? I am fighting him. But the law is complicated, and Ashworth has powerful friends. His hands clenched at his sides. If I could show that Charlotte is thriving under my care, that she is happy and healthy and well-adjusted, it would strengthen my position. But she barely speaks to anyone except you. The household staff will testify that she hides in her room, that she has no friends, that she is grieving, Rosalind finished softly. Still grieving, because no one has allowed her to. I have failed her. The admission seemed torn from him. I should have tried harder, but I did not know how. And now you learn. Rosalind took his hand. Propriety be damned. Starting today, starting now. Bring her with you tomorrow when you call. Let me help. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. Gratitude and hope and something deeper, something that made her heart stutter. Why? He asked. Why do you care so much about this, about her? Because I am falling in love with you, she thought. Because I cannot separate my feelings for you from my feelings for this girl you are trying so desperately to protect. Because your willingness to learn, to change, to feel, despite your fear. It is the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me, and you do not even realize it. Because she deserves it, Rosalind said instead. And so do you. Charlotte began accompanying Sebastian on his calls. At first she was silent and withdrawn, sitting in the corner of the Blackwood drawing-room while Sebastian and Rosalind made stilted conversation. But gradually, with gentle persistence, Rosalind drew her out. She taught Charlotte to play chess. My grandmother's method, which involves quite a bit of cheating, I warn you. She read aloud from novels while Charlotte embroidered, and Sebastian pretended to review paperwork, but actually listened with poorly concealed fascination. She convinced Charlotte to join her on morning walks in Hyde Park, where they talked about everything and nothing, and Charlotte slowly began to trust that someone cared about more than just managing her. And she watched Sebastian try. He was awkward at it painfully, endearingly awkward. He would hover in doorways, clearly wanting to participate but uncertain how. He would attempt jokes that fell flat, and then look so genuinely disappointed that Rosalind had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. He would ask Charlotte questions about her day, and then listen with such intense concentration that the poor girl felt like she was being interrogated. But he tried. Every day he tried a little harder, and Charlotte slowly began to respond. "He sat with me last night," Charlotte confided during one of their walks. "During the thunderstorm. I used to be afraid of storms. My mother would always come to my room and tell me stories until they passed. I thought—" Her voice caught. "I thought no one would ever do that again. But there he was, sitting on the edge of my bed, telling me about constellations, of all things. He knows so many facts about stars. It was very dull, actually. But it was—" She trailed off, searching for words. "It was him trying," Rosalind said. "Yes." Charlotte smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "It was him trying." The weeks blurred together in a haze of courtship calls, stolen glances, and the slow thawing of two hearts. Rosalind watched Sebastian transform from the cold, distant duke into something warmer, still reserved, still cautious, but increasingly willing to let her see behind the armor. He told her about his father's death, the chaos of the inheritance, the years of grinding work to restore the family fortunes. He told her about the loneliness of his position, the exhaustion of always having to be in control, the secret fear that he had sacrificed too much for duty and was no longer capable of anything softer. She told him about her grandmother, about her fear that no one would ever want her for herself, about the sharp tongue she had developed as armor against a world that saw her only as a dowry attached to an acceptable face. They were two people who had built walls, recognizing in each other the architecture of self-protection. And bit by bit, stone by stone, they began to take those walls down. Lady Thornton's masquerade ball arrived at the height of the season, and Rosalind knew before she arrived that something had shifted. The tension between her and Sebastian had reached a breaking point. Every accidental touch sent sparks through her. Every exchange of glances felt weighted with unspoken words. She dressed carefully that evening, choosing a gown of deep amber silk that brought out the gold in her hair. Her mask was delicate, feathered, designed to conceal just enough while revealing everything that mattered. When she arrived at the ball, Sebastian was waiting near the entrance. He was not wearing a mask. "Your Grace," she curtsied, heart pounding, "you seem to have forgotten part of your costume." "I am tired of hiding." His grey eyes burned into hers. "I am tired of costumes and masks and the careful performance that society requires. Tonight, I wish to be only myself." "And who is that?" "A man who has spent the past 2 months falling in love with a woman who terrifies him." He stepped closer, heedless of the crowd swirling around them. "A man who never wanted to feel anything, and who now cannot imagine feeling nothing ever again. A man who—" Sebastian. His name escaped her like a breath, like a prayer. "Dance with me." He held out his hand. "Dance with me, Rosalind, and then let me say what I have been trying to say for weeks." The waltz that followed was nothing like her dance with Lord Chester at the start of the season. This was movement as conversation, as connection, as the physical expression of everything they had not yet put into words. Sebastian's hand at her waist burned through the fabric of her gown. Her fingers trembled where they rested on his shoulder. "I practiced this," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "I actually hired a dancing master and practiced, because I wanted to be good enough. For you. You are." She could barely breathe. "You are good enough. You are." The music swelled, and he pulled her closer than propriety allowed, and she did not care. She did not care about the scandalized whispers, the pointed stares, the furious fanning of society matrons who would discuss this moment for weeks. She cared only about the man in her arms, the one who had learned to bring her wildflowers and listen to a grieving girl and try despite his fear. When the waltz ended, he did not release her. Instead, in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, the Duke of Thornfield went down on one knee. "Miss Blackwood," his voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent room, "Rosalind, I have spent my life believing that love was a weakness, that feeling deeply was a danger to be avoided. You have shown me how wrong I was. You have challenged me, infuriated me, humiliated me, and, in the process, you have undone every defense I ever built." She was trembling. She was openly trembling before all of London, and she could not bring herself to care. "I cannot promise I will be perfect," he continued. "I will still try to manage things that cannot be managed. I will still retreat into strategy when I am frightened. I will still—" His voice cracked slightly. "I will still struggle to feel things the way normal people feel them. But I can promise that I will try. Every day I will try to be worthy of you, if you will have me." The words hung in the air, and Rosalind opened her mouth to answer, "Enough of this charade." The Dowager Duchess's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She stepped forward from the crowd, her face twisted with cold fury. "I have tolerated this courtship because I believed my nephew would come to his senses, but I see now that stronger measures are required." She turned to face the assembled guests, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Before the Duke makes a fool of himself further, the Ton should know the truth about Miss Blackwood's circumstances. Aunt," Sebastian rose, his voice dangerous, "be very careful. Her father's shipping business has failed." The Dowager continued as though he had not spoken. "His ships were lost at sea 3 weeks ago. The Blackwood fortune is destroyed. The dowry that made Miss Blackwood barely acceptable as a match for my nephew no longer exists." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rosalind felt the blood drain from her face. "She is penniless," the Dowager continued, satisfaction dripping from every word. "A merchant's daughter without even a merchant's fortune to recommend her. Whatever understanding may have existed between her and my nephew is now clearly impossible. The Duke of Thornfield cannot marry a nobody." Sebastian's face had gone pale with fury. "This is not your decision to make." "It is done, Sebastian. I made certain of it. The rumors have already spread. By morning, all of London will know that Miss Blackwood is a fortune hunter who managed to trap your attention before her family's ruin became public." The Dowager smiled coldly. "The best thing you can do for both your reputations is to end this farce immediately." Rosalind could not breathe. She looked at Sebastian, searching his face for what? Confirmation? Denial? Some indication that this was a mistake, that her father's fortune was not destroyed, that the Dowager's venom was just the desperate strike of a woman losing control. But he was staring at his aunt with an expression she could not read, and before he could speak, before he could say anything at all, she did what her heart demanded. She fled. Through the ballroom, past the staring faces, down the grand staircase, and out into the cold night air. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, and the sounds of the ball had faded into nothing. And then she stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had allowed herself to hope for. The night air bit through Rosalind's thin silk gown as she stumbled down the street, her dancing slippers wholly inadequate for the cobblestones, her lungs burning with the effort of holding back sobs. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to be away. Away from the ballroom, away from the whispers, away from the devastating certainty that everything she had allowed herself to believe had been a lie. Behind her, she heard shouting her name, perhaps carried on the wind, but she did not turn. She could not bear to see Sebastian's face, to witness whatever expression he wore now that the truth of her circumstances had been laid bare. Would it be relief? Calculation? The cold efficiency of a man reassessing a business arrangement that no longer made financial sense? She had been a fool, a romantic, dreaming fool. A carriage rattled past, its lanterns casting dancing shadows on the pavement. Rosalind pressed herself against a garden wall, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, a woman alone on a dark London street, dressed for a ball, tears streaming down her face. This was dangerous. This was exactly the sort of behavior that ruined reputations beyond repair. Perhaps that no longer mattered. If the dowager's claims were true, if her father's ships had truly been lost, if the family fortune was destroyed, then her reputation was already in tatters. The ton would remember her as the merchant's daughter who had aimed too high, who had somehow bewitched a duke into courting her before her house of cards collapsed. They would whisper that she had known, that she had been desperately trying to secure the match before the truth emerged. Fortune hunter, schemer, social climber. Everything she had fought so hard to prove she was not. Rosalind sank onto a low garden wall, heedless of the damp seeping through her gown. The mask she had worn to the masquerade was still clutched in her hand. She stared at it, at the delicate feathers and glittering beads, and thought about how apt it was. She had been wearing masks for years, the sharp-tongued wit to hide her vulnerability, the defensive rejection of suitors to disguise her desperate hope for real connection. And Sebastian had worn masks too, the cold efficiency hiding a man who had never learned how to feel safely. They had been taking those masks off, slowly, carefully, together. And now this. She did not know how long she sat there, long enough for the chill to settle into her bones, for her tears to dry on her cheeks, for the distant sounds of carriages and revelry to fade into a muffled quiet. When she finally rose, her legs were stiff, and her thoughts had crystallized into something hard and painful. She would go home. She would learn the truth about her father's situation. She would face whatever came next with her head held high, because that was what she had always done. And she would not allow herself to think about Sebastian Ashworth, Duke of Thornfield, until she had the strength to do so without breaking. The Blackwood townhouse was dark when she arrived, save for a single lamp burning in the front window, her mother's signal that she was waiting up, that there would be no escaping the conversation to come. Rosalind let herself in quietly, hoping against hope that she might make it to her room before Rosalind. Her father's voice came from the doorway of his study, gentle and tired. Edward Blackwood was a large man, broad-shouldered and still handsome in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his youth on ships before building an empire from a single trading vessel. He was in his shirt-sleeves, his cravat loosened, a glass of brandy in his hand. He looked like a man who had been waiting for bad news. "Papa," her voice cracked on the word. "Is it true? The dowager said she said your ships—" "Come in, my dear. Sit down." The study was warm, a fire crackling in the grate despite the late hour. Rosalind sank into the chair across from her father's desk and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "One ship," her father said quietly. "The Marianne. She went down in a storm off the Portuguese coast 3 weeks ago. The cargo was lost, and we took a significant financial hit. But the dowager said she said the fortune was destroyed. The Dowager Duchess is a woman who shapes truth to serve her purposes." Edward Blackwood's voice hardened. "The loss of the Marianne is serious, but not catastrophic. It will require us to tighten our belts for a year or two, cancel some planned expansions, Perhaps sell the country house. But we are far from ruined. Relief flooded through Rosalind, so intense it left her dizzy. Then why would she say, because she wanted to break your attachment to her nephew? Her father took a long sip of brandy. She came to see me yesterday, you know, offered me a substantial sum to convince you to end the courtship. When I refused, she made it clear she would take matters into her own hands. She tried to bribe you? She tried to buy you off. There is a difference, though I confess I'm too tired to pass it at the moment. He set down his glass and looked at her with the keen, assessing gaze that had built an empire from nothing. The question now is, what do you want? Rosalind stared at him. What do I want? The Duke. This courtship. This path you have been walking these past months. He leaned forward. I have watched you change, Rosalind. I have watched you soften in ways I had begun to fear you never would. You smile more. You laugh more. You speak of the future with something other than resignation. He paused. Do you love him? The question hung in the air, stark and impossible to evade. I do not know, she whispered. I thought I was beginning to. But if he believes what his aunt said, if he thinks I am penniless and was only after his money, then he is a fool, and you are well rid of him. But what if... She stopped, forcing herself to confront the fear she had been avoiding. What if it was all strategy? What if the courtship was just another negotiation, another transaction, and the moment the terms changed, a commotion in the hallway cut her off. Raised voices, her mother's sharp tones, and beneath them a deeper voice that made Rosalind's heart stop entirely. I do not care if it is past midnight, madam. I do not care if Miss Blackwood is indisposed. I will see her now, or I will stand on your doorstep until morning, and you may explain to the neighbours why the Duke of Thornfield has taken up residence on your front steps. The study door burst open, and Sebastian stood in the doorway. He was dishevelled, cravat askew, coat unbuttoned, hair falling across his forehead, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. His grey eyes were wild, frantic, utterly unlike the controlled man she had come to know. Rosalind. Her name was a ragged breath. Thank God. I have been searching half of London. I thought something had happened to you. Your Grace. Her father rose, his voice carefully neutral. Perhaps you would care to explain why you are bursting into my home in the middle of the night. Sebastian did not even glance at him. His gaze was fixed on Rosalind with an intensity that made her feel pinned in place. I am sorry, he said. I am so sorry. My aunt, what she did, I had no idea. You had no idea she was going to publicly destroy my reputation? I knew she was scheming. I knew she opposed our match, but I did not think she would. He broke off, jaw clenching. It does not matter what I thought. What matters is that you left, and I did not stop you. And I have spent the last 2 hours tearing London apart trying to find you. Why? The question stopped him cold. Why? Why did you come after me? Rosalind rose from her chair, surprised to find that her legs held steady beneath her. The Dowager told the entire ton that I am penniless. Whether or not it is true, and for the record, it is not. Though you might have thought to ask before assuming the damage is done. Everyone believes I am a fortune hunter who ensnared you before my family's ruin became public. The scandal will follow us both. The rational thing, the strategic thing, would be to accept the broken engagement and move forward. There is no engagement to break. His voice was rough. I never finished proposing. You fled before I could... Before you could what? Calculate whether a merchant's daughter without a fortune was still worth the investment. Something cracked in his expression, a breaking open of all the walls he had so carefully maintained. "Before I could tell you that I love you." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "I love you," he repeated, as though the first time had not been quite enough. "Not your dowry, not your family connections, not your qualifications as a potential duchess. You, the woman who laughed at me in front of 500 people. The woman who demanded I prove myself worthy of her. The woman who taught a grieving child to trust again, and in the process taught me that feeling was not weakness." He crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her hands in his, heedless of her father watching from the corner. "I spent a decade building walls against love because I saw what it did to my father. I convinced myself that control was safety, that efficiency was strength, that keeping everyone at arm's length was the only way to protect myself and those who depended on me." His grip tightened. "You made me want to tear those walls down. You made me want to be vulnerable, to feel, to risk everything for the chance of something real. Sebastian, let me finish. Please." He took a shaking breath. "When my aunt made her announcement, my first thought was not about your fortune. It was not about scandal or strategy or what society would say. My first thought was that you would think I had changed my mind, that you would believe the worst of me, that you would run, and I would never get the chance to tell you," his voice broke, "to tell you that you are the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me, and I would not change a moment of it, to tell you that I want to build a life with you, not a transaction, not a partnership of convenience, but a life, with laughter and arguments and wildflowers, and everything I never let myself want." Rosalind's eyes were burning. Her heart was racing. Every defense she had ever built was crumbling around her. "I spoke to your father," Sebastian continued. "On the way here, in the carriage I commandeered to search for you. I asked his permission to marry you properly, this time, and he told me that the decision was yours alone. So I am asking you, Rosalind, not because you meet my criteria, not because of your fortune, which I neither need nor care about, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." He released her hands and reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box. "I have been carrying this for 2 weeks, he said, opening it to reveal a ring unlike any Rosalind had ever seen. Not a diamond, but a delicate cluster of colored stones in the shapes of flowers. The jeweler thought I was mad. He kept showing me traditional settings, conventional gems. I told him I needed something that captured the spirit of a woman who preferred wildflowers to roses. Rosalind stared at the ring, at the tiny sapphire bluebells and amethyst violets, at the obvious thought and care that had gone into its creation. "Sebastian," her voice was barely a whisper, "marry me." He went down on one knee, right there in her father's study, his grey eyes bright with hope and terror in equal measure. "Marry me, Rosalind, not for convenience or strategy or any of the reasons I once thought mattered. Marry me because I love you, and I believe you might love me too, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of that love." For a long moment, Rosalind did not speak. She looked at this man, this proud, guarded, infuriating man, kneeling before her with his heart laid bare. She thought about the walls they had both built, the fears they had both carried, the slow and terrifying process of letting someone in. She thought about wildflowers and Charlotte and late-night conversations, and the way he looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he had never known to ask. "Yes," she said. The word hung in the air for one perfect, crystalline moment. "Yes," she repeated, stronger now. "You impossible, infuriating, wonderful man. Yes, I will marry you." Sebastian's face transformed. The hope ignited into joy, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw him smile. Truly smile, without reservation or calculation, or the careful control that usually governed his expressions. He slid the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into his arms. "I should warn you," he murmured against her hair. "I am still going to be terrible at this. I will still try to manage things that cannot be managed. I will still retreat into strategy when I am frightened. I will still... I know." She pulled back to look at him, her hands resting on his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her palms. "And I will still challenge you and infuriate you and refuse to let you hide behind your walls. We will be terrible at this together, and we will learn together, and it will be messy and imperfect and absolutely worth it." "Together," he repeated, as though the word itself were a revelation. "Together." Behind them, Edward Blackwood cleared his throat. "I do not mean to interrupt," he said, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "But perhaps this conversation might be continued somewhere other than my study. Your mother, I fear, is about to have hysterics in the hallway, and I believe congratulations are in order." The next hours were a blur of tears and laughter, and Mrs. Blackwood's extremely loud opinions about wedding planning. Rosalind's sisters were roused from their beds to receive the news. Clara wept and hugged her. Beatrice demanded to know if she could be a bridesmaid. Little Margaret asked solemnly if the Duke would teach her to ride horses. Sebastian bore it all with remarkable patience, answering Margaret's questions with grave seriousness and promising Beatrice a significant role in the wedding party. When Mrs. Blackwood finally allowed them a moment alone, chaperoned, of course, by Clara dozing in the corner, he caught Rosalind's hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "My aunt will not accept this gracefully." "I did not expect her to. She may make things difficult. She has influence, and she is not above using it. Then we will face her together." Rosalind met his eyes. "You said you would no longer hide behind walls. This is what that looks like, confronting the people who would keep you isolated and afraid." "I know." He paused. "I went to her first, before I came to find you. I told her that if she ever moved against you or your family again, I would use every ounce of influence I possess to destroy her socially. I would cut off her allowance, bar her from Thornfield properties, and make it publicly known that her claims about your family were deliberate lies." Rosalind stared at him. "You threatened your own aunt?" "I protected my future wife." His voice was hard. "She needed to understand that her position in my household is contingent on her behavior, and that I will not tolerate any further attempts to manipulate my life or hurt the people I love." "Sebastian." Rosalind did not know whether to be touched or horrified. "She will retire to the country estate," he continued. "She has already agreed. I suspect she will eventually reconcile herself to the situation. She is pragmatic, if nothing else, but until then, she will not trouble us." "Just like that?" "Just like that." He lifted her hand and kissed her palm, his lips warm against her skin. "I told you I would learn to protect what matters. You matter, Rosalind. More than duty, more than reputation, more than anything I once thought was important." She leaned forward and kissed him properly, fully, with none of the propriety that had governed their courtship. He made a soft sound of surprise, and then responded in kind, one hand cupping her face, while the other drew her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Clara was pointedly looking at the ceiling. "Perhaps," Rosalind managed, "we should return to discussing wedding dates." The smile Sebastian gave her was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They married 6 weeks later, in a quiet ceremony attended only by those who truly mattered, the Blackwood family, Charlotte, a handful of genuine friends from both their circles. There was no grand society wedding, no hundreds of guests gathered to witness the union of the Duke of Thornfield and the merchant's daughter. There was only a small country church, sunlight streaming through ancient windows, and two people pledging themselves to each other with open hearts. Rosalind wore a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, with wild flowers woven through her hair instead of the traditional orange blossoms. Charlotte stood beside her as bridesmaid, glowing with a happiness that would have been unthinkable a few months before. Sebastian waited at the altar in his formal attire, but when Rosalind reached him, she saw that his cravat pin was a tiny bluebell wrought in sapphire, a private symbol that made her heart swell. "You look," he murmured as she took her place beside him, "like everything I never let myself want. You are going to make me cry before we even say our vows. Then I shall endeavor to be more stoic." But his eyes were shining, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for hers. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. They spoke their vows clearly, looking into each other's eyes, meaning every word. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget they had an audience at all. Afterwards, there was a wedding breakfast at Sebastian's country estate, the one that had been the dowager's retreat, now transformed into a warm and welcoming home. Charlotte had helped with the decorations, strewing wildflowers across every available surface and hanging ribbons in Rosalind's favourite colours. She wanted it to be perfect, Sebastian explained quietly, watching his ward direct servants with the confidence of a young lady who had finally found her place. "She has been planning this for weeks. I believe she may have also written a poem, though she refused to let me read it. She seems so different from the girl I met that first day." "She is." His voice softened. "She is laughing again. She is making friends. Last week she asked if she might call you aunt once we were married, and I do not think I have ever been so moved by a simple question." Rosalind's eyes stung. "What did you tell her?" "I told her she would have to ask you herself. I did not wish to presume." As if summoned by the conversation, Charlotte appeared at Rosalind's elbow, her face flushed with excitement and a touch of nervousness. "The poem was dreadful," she announced. "I burned it, but I practiced a speech instead, and I think it is somewhat less embarrassing, so may I say it now?" Sebastian opened his mouth to protest, but Rosalind caught his arm. "We would be honored to hear it." Charlotte took a deep breath. "When my parents died, I thought I would never be happy again. I thought no one would ever understand me or care about me the way they did. And then you came. Rosalind, I mean. Aunt Rosalind, if you will allow me to call you that, and you listened. You actually listened, not like you were waiting for me to stop talking, but like what I said mattered. And then Uncle Sebastian started trying too, really trying, and I realized that maybe there was still room for happiness. Maybe family could be something you built, not just something you were born into." She paused, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know I am not very good at saying things. I know I was difficult and cold and silent for a long time, but I wanted you both to know that I am grateful. For this family, for the chance to belong somewhere again." Rosalind's composure crumbled. She pulled Charlotte into a fierce hug, feeling the girl's thin shoulders shake with suppressed emotion. "You belong with us," she whispered, "always, no matter what." When she finally released Charlotte, Sebastian's eyes were suspiciously red. "I believe," he said, his voice rough, "that I have something in my eye. The pollen in this room is atrocious." "Of course it is," Rosalind agreed, not bothering to hide her smile. The rest of the celebration passed in a golden haze of laughter and congratulations. Rosalind's sisters monopolized the dance floor. Her father engaged Sebastian in a surprisingly animated conversation about shipping investments. Her mother cried happy tears and made increasingly elaborate pronouncements about future grandchildren. As evening fell, and the guests began to depart, Sebastian found Rosalind on the terrace, overlooking the gardens, a quiet echo of that first meeting at Lady Pemberton's ball. "Hiding from my mother?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Hiding from her very specific opinions about nursery decorations. She has already planned the christening, apparently, and we have been married for approximately 8 hours." Sebastian laughed, still a sound that surprised her, still a sound that made her heart sing. "My aunt once informed me that producing an heir was my primary responsibility as Duke. I told her that I would manage my own reproductive timeline, thank you very much, and she did not speak to me for 3 days. I am beginning to think I would have liked to witness more of your interactions with the Dowager. They were largely tedious, punctuated by moments of mutual frustration." He paused, his expression softening. "But that chapter of my life is over. She has retreated to the dower house in Sussex and shows no signs of returning. Charlotte is thriving, and I am—" He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "Happy?" Rosalind offered. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also happy, which I am beginning to think might be the same thing." She turned to face him fully, taking in the lines of his face in the fading light. He was so different from the cold, controlled man who had proposed to her with a list of qualifications. The vulnerability in his eyes now was something she had learned to recognize and treasure, proof that behind the iron walls there was warmth and depth and the capacity for genuine feeling. "I love you," she said. "I do not think I said it properly before, with all the chaos and the proposals and the dramatic reconciliations. But I do. I love you, Sebastian Ashworth. I love your terrible jokes and your awkward attempts at comfort and the way you look at Charlotte like she is the most precious thing in the world. I love that you learned to bring me wildflowers and that you threatened your aunt to protect me and that you are willing to be terrified if it means being happy." His breath caught audibly. "Rosalind, I know you will still retreat into strategy sometimes. I know I will still challenge you and infuriate you. But I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. Whatever walls we have to tear down, whatever fears we have to face, we face them together, from now until the end of everything." He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, his face pressed into her hair. "Together," he repeated, the word muffled but fervent. "From now until the end of everything." They stood there as the stars emerged overhead, two people who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, and that love, despite its terrors, was worth every risk. 8 years later, on a warm spring evening, Rosalind stood at the edge of Lady Pemberton's ballroom and watched her husband attempt to corral their children. The twins, Sophia and Catherine, aged 6, had discovered the refreshment table and were methodically testing every variety of biscuit. Their elder brother James, 8 and dignified, was trying to convince them to show some decorum, while simultaneously eyeing the lemon tarts with obvious longing. Sebastian had been dispatched to restore order. From across the room, Rosalind could see him crouching to speak to the girls at their level, his expression grave as he negotiated terms of biscuit surrender. Whatever he said made Sophia giggle, and Catherine throw her arms around his neck. He emerged from the encounter with one twin on each hip and an expression of long-suffering amusement. "He is completely hopeless with them," Charlotte observed, coming to stand beside her. At 23, Charlotte had blossomed into a confident young woman, happily married to a kind-eyed viscount who adored her. Her own daughter, barely a year old, was sleeping in the nursery upstairs. "He cannot refuse them anything." "I know." Rosalind smiled. "I find it charming." "You find everything he does charming. It is actually somewhat nauseating." "You are one to talk. I have seen the way you look at Henry." Charlotte blushed, but did not deny it. "Fair point." She paused, watching Sebastian make his way across the room with their daughters still clinging to him like particularly well-dressed barnacles. "I wanted to thank you again, for everything. I know I have said it before, but—" "Charlotte," Rosalind caught her hand, "you do not have to keep thanking me." "I know, but I want to." Charlotte's grey eyes, so like Sebastian's, were bright with emotion. "When I came to live with Uncle Sebastian, I was certain I would never be happy again. I was so angry and so sad and so convinced that no one could ever fill the space my parents left. And then you came along and proved me wrong. Not by trying to replace them, you never did that, but by showing me that there was still room in my life for love, for family, for hope." Rosalind's throat tightened. "You showed yourself that, my dear. I merely helped you see it." "You are too modest." Charlotte squeezed her hand. "But I will let you have this one." Sebastian reached them with the twins, looking slightly disheveled but triumphant. "I have negotiated a ceasefire," he announced. 2 biscuits each, to be consumed before dinner rather than after, in exchange for no more climbing under the refreshment table." "There was climbing under the refreshment table?" Rosalind asked. "There was an attempt. I intercepted it." He set the twins down, and they immediately raced off to find their brother, their earlier misbehavior already forgotten. "I am too old for this." "You are 40, Sebastian. That is not old. It feels old when one has a 6-year-old on each hip." But he was, smiling, the creases around his eyes deep with contentment. "Have I mentioned that I love you today?" "Only 4 times. I am slipping." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Rosalind Ashworth. I love our chaotic, biscuit-stealing children. I love this life we have built together." "Even when the twins climb under refreshment tables?" "Especially then." He pulled her closer, heedless of the society matrons watching with barely concealed interest. "Because 8 years ago, I was a man who thought he could not feel anything without being destroyed. And now I have you and Charlotte and 3 children who refuse to respect the proper hierarchy of meal courses, and I am happier than I ever thought possible." Across the room, the orchestra struck up a waltz, the same waltz, Rosalind realized, that had been playing the night of Lady Thornton's masquerade ball, the night Sebastian had proposed, and the Dowager had tried to destroy them, and everything had seemed hopeless. "Dance with me," Sebastian murmured, echoing the words he had spoken that night. "Here, now, the children. Charlotte will watch them, and I believe we have some unfinished business on this terrace." He led her through the ballroom, past the gossiping guests and the musicians and their own children, who barely spared them a glance as they disappeared through the glass doors. The terrace was quiet, the London evening soft with spring warmth. Somewhere in the gardens below, a nightingale was singing. "This is where it all began," Sebastian said, pulling her into his arms. "This very terrace. You told me I had forgotten to ask you. And you told me you would learn." Rosalind smiled up at him. "I believe you have. I am still learning. Every day, with you." He began to move, leading her in a slow waltz that had nothing to do with the music drifting from inside and everything to do with the rhythm of their own hearts. "Do you know what I was thinking that night at the Pemberton ball, when you laughed at me in front of everyone?" "I have always wondered. I was thinking that I had never met anyone who had the courage to do what you did, to refuse what society told you to accept, to demand more than anyone thought you deserved." His grey eyes held hers. "I was thinking that you were the most extraordinary woman I had ever encountered, and that I was almost certainly going to make a complete fool of myself trying to win you. You did make a complete fool of yourself. I know. It was worth it." He dipped her suddenly, making her gasp and clutch at his shoulders. Every moment of humiliation, every awkward attempt at courtship, every lesson in wild flowers and listening and feeling without armor. Worth it. He pulled her upright and kissed her, the way he had wanted to kiss her that first night, deeply, thoroughly, without concern for propriety or society or anything but the woman in his arms. When they broke apart, Rosalind was breathless and smiling. "I was thinking something too," she said, "that night, after you accepted my challenge." "What?" "I was thinking that despite everything, despite the humiliation and the manipulation and the complete absurdity of the situation, I was curious about you, about who you were beneath the armor, about what you might become if someone challenged you to feel." She touched his face, tracing the lines that had deepened with laughter over the years. "I was thinking that you might be worth knowing." "And?" His voice was husky. "Was I?" "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." She kissed him again, soft and sweet. "You and our children, and this life we have built. Every argument, every challenge, every moment of messy, imperfect love, I would not trade a second of it." The nightingale sang on in the garden. Inside, their children were probably getting into some new mischief that Charlotte was valiantly attempting to manage. The ton continued to swirl and gossip and concern itself with scandals that would be forgotten by morning. And on the terrace where they had first begun, Rosalind and Sebastian danced beneath the stars, two people who had learned that the greatest risk was not love itself, but the failure to try. "Sebastian?" Rosalind murmured against his shoulder. "Thank you for learning to ask properly." He laughed, the sound rich and warm and entirely unguarded. "Thank you," he said, "for being worth asking." They danced on, wrapped in each other and in the life they had chosen, until Charlotte appeared in the doorway to inform them, with studied patience, that James had accidentally knocked over a candelabra, and perhaps they should return to supervise before the entire ballroom caught fire. Sebastian sighed. "I suppose we must. I suppose we must." But Rosalind was smiling as she took his hand and led him back inside, back to their children and their chaos and their perfectly imperfect life. Behind them, the nightingale finished its song, and the stars shone on over London, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. But in the Thornfield carriage an hour later, crammed with 3 sleeping children and 1 exhausted husband, Rosalind found herself thinking that the stars were wrong to be indifferent. Because love, real love, hard-won love, love that had been tested and challenged and proven true, was the most extraordinary thing the universe had ever created. And she was lucky enough to have found it. She leaned her head against Sebastian's shoulder and closed her eyes, listening to her children breathe and her husband's heartbeat and the quiet sounds of a life she had never dared to dream she would have. "I love you," she whispered, too soft for anyone but him to hear. His arm tightened around her. "I know," he whispered back. "I love you too. Forever." Forever sounded exactly right.